Hi everybody, and welcome to week 4. And this week we're going to be looking at another naturalistic method. This one's a fairly recent method. It was developed in the late 1960s, early 1970s by an American psychologist named James Asher. The method is known as total physical response, sometimes known by its initials TPR. And I just want to review a little bit about the naturalistic methods and what the characteristics of those methods are. So all of the naturalistic methods attempt to mimic the way that first languages are learned. Each one is a little bit different in its approach, but each one is attempting to follow the natural course, hence it's called a naturalistic method, natural course of first language acquisition. The focus, therefore, is on communication, not on language form, because nobody acquires their native language by drilling grammar patterns. That's just not how it's done. Language elements in naturalistic methods are always taught inductively, meaning the student is not given formal instruction on how something works and then given material to apply that knowledge with. They are not given lists of words in the native language with the target language equivalent and asked to memorize them. That's not at all how it's done. Rather, they're given things in context. They are taught through pictures or real objects or pantomime or the teacher drawing on the board. But the student is given the chance to deduce meaning for themselves. And the same is true with grammar. It's taught inductively. It's not presented in a lecture. The students are given lots of examples of how a sentence is created. And the other thing about them is that they always use authentic language. That's really important because you do not want to teach students forms that are not used the way real life speakers use them. And by real life speakers, we're talking about people who speak the language as their native language. And as a result, there's no effort to simplify language forms. They are what they are, and the goal is to provide enough examples so that the student can deduce the meaning and figure out how the construction works on their own. But you don't simplify it. You don't change the word order in English. You don't try to make irregular verbs regular. You present them the way they are actually used. James Asher, who we'll get to in a moment, formalized this language, but there is actually a predecessor to it, a French educator by the name of François Gouin. Gouin was quite a brilliant student, and his professors in France recommended that he go and study philosophy in Berlin because at that time the German university system was considered the best in Europe. And so he left France and went to Hamburg without knowing a single word of German. And while he was in Germany, he tried to learn German through every method that he knew of. He memorized dictionaries, he read grammar, he followed language instruction books. He made himself crazy. He actually studied so hard that he went temporarily blind from all of the reading that he was doing. And no matter what method he tried, he was unsuccessful in communicating with his landlord or with people on the street. It just did not happen. And he was very frustrated. He went home for a holiday visit. And while he was there, he spent a lot of time with his 3-year-old nephew. Now, when he had gone to Germany, the boy was only just over a year old, and he was not yet verbal. Gawain comes home and the kid is like speaking a mile a minute to everybody. So he has mastered his first language in the time that Gawain has been away. And the kid is very curious about everything, as little kids often are. And so his father took him on a visit to a mill, a corn mill or a grain mill. And Gawain describes this visit, this kid's visit. He is all over the place. He wants to know everything about how the mill works. And the mill workers are thrilled. This breaks up the tedium of their day. They're taking this kid around, showing him everything, showing him the grain before it goes through the chute, and showing him the wheels and everything. And the kid is utterly fascinated by this. He goes home, and for a while he doesn't say anything. He's just thinking about it. But pretty soon he starts describing his experience at the mill to everybody who will listen. And Gawain noted that he would, the story was always the same in broad outline, but he would miss a few details in some of the retellings, and he'd have to double back and correct things. And over and over and over again, he is reenacting the entire process in his mind. So he is so obsessed with this that his dad creates a little model mill in the garden and uses the garden stream to create a waterfall and a mill race so that it actually turns and it actually grinds. And this is, he also, Mom makes a whole set of little bags for him. They fill them with sand to represent the grain and the flour. And here is how Gawain describes what his nephew does next. When the mill was definitely mounted and set a-going, the little miller filled his sacks, loaded them on his shoulders with a simulated effort accompanied by a grimace. Then, bent and grunting beneath the weight, carried his grain to the mill, shot it out and ground it, so reproducing the sense of a real mill, not as he had seen it, but as he had afterwards conceived it to himself, as he had generalized it. Whilst doing all this, he expressed all his acts aloud, dwelling most particularly upon one word, and this word was the verb, always the verb. The other terms came and tumbled about as they might. 10 times the sack was emptied, refilled, carried to the mill, and its contents ground in imagination. It was during the course of this operation, carried out again and again without ceasing, repeated aloud, that a flash of light suddenly shot across my mind, and I exclaimed softly to myself, "I have found it. Now I understand." And following with fresh interest this precious operation, by means of which I had caught a glimpse of a secret so long sought after, I caught sight of a fresh art, that of learning a language. Testing at leisure the truth of my first intuition, and finding it conform more and more to reality, I wandered about repeating to myself the words of the poet, "Je vois, j'entends, je sais." Based on his nephew's reenactment of grinding flour, Gawain developed a method for teaching the language that, as he said, "Je vois, I hear, j'entends, I see, je sais, I say." Gawain's approach was an added value for the direct method. It added a dimension to the use of pictures and realia for teaching vocabulary. Now there was a method that could be used to teach verbs and grammar and sentence structures. So based on his nephew's experience, Gawain identified 3 phases. He referred to them as reception, this was the visit to the mill; reflection, the boy's reflection of what he saw, and design, which was the construction of the mill. And this is how Guin translated those three phases into a method for teaching. He wrote a sample lesson. We will suppose the occasion to be a lesson in French, beginning with the exercise by which we generally initiate pupils into our method. I open the door of the classroom. First of all, I briefly announce this aim and present it as such. Then I set forth in the native tongue of the children the successive means by which this end can be attained, to wit, I walk to the door, I walk. I draw near the door, I draw near. I draw nearer and nearer, I draw nearer. I get to the door, I get to. I stop at the door, I stop. I stretch out my arm, I stretch out. I take hold of the handle, I take hold. I turn the handle, I turn. I open the door, I open. I pull the door, I pull. The door moves, moves. The door turns on its hinges, turns. The door turns and turns, turns. I open the door wide, I open. I let go the handle, let go. The end proposed is attained, my volition is realized, I stop. My exercise is dictated and written not upon paper, but upon the ears, and by way of the ears it has penetrated the mind. One of the pupils, the weakest or most distracted, should now go through this analysis again in English, and the whole class should be invited to imagine clearly to themselves not only the end but the successive means by which it is attained. This is done when the whole class have thought the exercise. The teacher once more takes the phrase in English, detaches the verb, I walk, and thereupon throws the French verb, marcher, upon which he emphasizes by repeating it several times over slowly, marcher, 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 and then he calls for the second sentence, and so on, and so on. So the way this would work is that Guin would go through the processes in the student's native language. That was reception. The students would then reflect upon it. He would ask one to repeat the various steps while the rest of the class thought about what they saw. And then he would add in the French component, and that was how he got the students to learn French. Eventually, he would have the whole class standing up and repeating the actions and describing them as they went. Remembering that for a time, direct method goes out of fashion and is replaced again by other methods, especially audiolingualism, and of course going back and forth with the various forms of the grammar translation method. Along comes an American psychologist by the name of James Asher. Asher had studied psychology and had completed a series of postdoctoral courses in linguistics, in educational research, and in Arabic. And it was during his postdoctoral work that he began observing how young children acquire their native language. Two important observations came about during this research. One was that for small children, physical action plays a large role in their acquisition of their first language. This is exactly the same thing Guin observed with his nephew. The nephew was describing every action that he did and emphasizing verbs. And Asher noted that that was also true with the small children he was observing. But he also noted that once children have reached a stage where they understand, or they're starting to understand, but don't necessarily have a large vocabulary, that the parent carries the burden of the conversation and does this by issuing lots and lots of commands. They give children directions. They use the imperative, much more so than is used in normal conversation between equals, or equal conversations between people who are not equal in status. There are not so many commands issued. But he noticed that that was the case with the parents interacting with their children. And he based his method, total physical response, on these two observations. One, an emphasis on action and on verbs, and two, on the use of commands. So in a TPR classroom, the teacher issues all kinds of commands. They use the imperative or the command or tsivui form. That's used over and over and over again. So the teacher issues a command and the students act upon that command by performing the action. The teacher models it first while speaking, and then has students do it with him or her, and then subsequently has the students just doing it while the teacher just gives the directions. All of the tenses in the language are taught this way, all verb forms. You'll see how that's done. There's a description of that in the textbook. And students are allowed to speak at any time, but they're not pressured to. The idea that Asher had is that nobody pressures a toddler to start speaking. They just do it when they're ready. And he felt that that should also be applied in second language acquisition. And the way that comprehension is assessed is through the actions. If a student is successful in completing the action when the teacher gives the command, it means that the student understands. So there are some differences between TPR and Gouin's method. First, students don't speak until they're ready to in a TPR classroom. Gouin encouraged students to speak very early. So the teacher would speak and then the students would speak. In TPR, the focus is on imperative verbs. All of the other forms are de-emphasized. In Gouin's method, the emphasis is on present tense first and subsequently on all of the other tenses. In TPR, the language is spoken at native-like or near-native-like speed. In Gouin's method, the language is spoken at native-like or near-native-like speed. In TPR, errors are corrected when the action is incorrect. In other words, if the student doesn't perform the correct act, the teacher remodels it, shows them the action while issuing the command. And that way they're corrected, but it's a slightly more light-handed method of correction. In Gouin's method, errors pretty much were corrected through repetition, with the teacher repeating the phrase correctly. And in TPR, spoken errors, as a general rule, are not corrected in the early stages unless they affect understanding. So if a student leaves off a little word or some kind of, something, the teacher doesn't correct it as long as the message is understood. This brings us to Hebrew Through Movement. Hebrew Through Movement was a program that was designed to apply the method of total physical response and adapt it for use in teaching Hebrew, especially teaching Hebrew in Jewish supplementary school settings. It was developed by the faculty of Siegel College. Siegel College was originally a sister school of Graz. Gratz began as a Jewish teachers college, a college to train the Jewish teachers to work in the Jewish schools in Philadelphia. Siegel College, which came about 25 years or so after Gratz, was originally the Jewish Teachers College of Cleveland. It subsequently became an independent college of Jewish studies, as did Gratz. And in the early 2000s, the Siegel family donated a large amount of money to keep the school running, and it changed its name to Siegel College. Siegel College closed in 2012. It was absorbed into Case Western Reserve, where it is the Siegel Program of Lifelong Learning, or Institute of Lifelong Learning, and it no longer grants degrees of any variety. Hebrew Through Movement was taken over at that time by the Cleveland Center for Jewish Studies, Jewish Education, and they have been running the program ever since. As I said, it's designed to adapt TPR for use in supplementary Hebrew schools. It did a very big service to those of us in Hebrew education, because it opened up the discussion again for how Hebrew should be used and taught in supplementary education, and it provided a very positive means for integrating real Hebrew language into supplementary Jewish education, which has gone back and forth on the issue of whether or not Hebrew should even be taught as a language, or if it should simply be taught for decoding and prayer. However, Hebrew Through Movement is not without some controversy. Two areas in particular we're going to look at. One is that instead of using the imperative, Hebrew College uses the infinitive form of the verb as if it were the imperative. Now, this is controversial. There are times in Hebrew when the infinitive is used or is usable as an imperative, always with the word please, either bavakasha or na, and only in limited circumstances. So you can say bavakasha lehakir, please meet, or you can say na leshevet, please be seated. But these are very restricted times. As a general rule, the infinitive is not the imperative, and it's a very serious issue from a TPR point of view, because if the imperative is how small children learn the language, you can't just substitute some other verb form and call it a day. You need to stick with the actual form. Remember, language should be taught in its authentic form, not stripping it down for convenience or ease. And the reason, and they are upfront about this, the reason that they use the infinitive is they don't want to get into the issue of gender and singular and plural. But in Hebrew, imperatives, there are only 3 forms. So I think this is a silly argument. You're saying a kid can learn 1 form of a verb but not 3? That's ridiculous. And if you give them enough examples, the students will easily deduce which form should be used in which circumstance. Perhaps the more controversial area is their most recent claim that you should not teach decoding until 5th or 6th grade. This is strictly to facilitate bar and bat mitzvah, but it actually, I think, harms both the language method and the student's ability to really learn and master decoding. So, as we go through this week, there are a few items for your consideration. First, I want you to think in terms of what age group you think this method is best suited for. Should it be used with adult learners? Is it best with small children? Is it better with teenagers? Who do you think will benefit most from this kind of approach? What do you think the role of reading and writing should be, especially early in the early stages of second language learning? This is a very big question in terms of Hebrew through movement, but it is really a big question with regard to choice of method. How important do you think reading and writing are going to be, or should we only focus on hearing and speaking? Another issue is, what are the differences between first and second language acquisition? And how should the methods that you use account for those differences as well as for the similarities? Those are questions that will help you drive the issue and drive the formation of lesson plans and choice of specific method for teaching specific items. And finally, you need to decide if the method is attractive to you. Is this something you can see yourself doing with a class of students, especially in the unique kind of setting in which each of you works? So with that said, I look forward to this week's forum discussions, which have been very robust so far, and I will see you all again. I'll speak to you all again next week.